If someone had told me a year ago that my entire world would pivot on its axis in the fluorescent-lit aisles of a 24-hour convenience store, I would have offered them a weak, pitying smile. My world wasn't one for pivots. It was a place of straight lines and predictable orbits, a small, quiet planet of one. My routine was my gravity. Wake up, work from the glowing rectangle on my desk, eat something forgettable, and, around 10 o'clock at night when the city's pulse slowed to a murmur, make the pilgrimage. The pilgrimage to the corner store for the kind of snacks that screamed, lonely, but making the best of it. The store was an anchor in my neighborhood, a beacon of perpetual light called the Night Owl, and he was its keeper. Marcus. For a year, he had been a fixed point in my nightly ritual, a silent, imposing landmark I navigated with a carefully cultivated air of indifference. He was built of solid lines and hard angles, a stark contrast to my own frayed edges. Broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his black t-shirt, arms covered in a tapestry of faded tattoos I could never quite decipher, and a face that seemed carved from stone, perpetually set in a neutral expression that bordered on a scowl. He was, to me, a figure of mythic proportions, the strong, silent type written into the DNA of 1,000 stories. He moved with an economy of motion that suggested immense, contained strength. The way he'd lift a heavy box of sodas with one hand, the deliberate thud as he set it down. The way his hands, calloused and sure, would scan my items. A bag of salt and vinegar chips, a bar of dark chocolate, a bottle of sparkling water. The same 3 things every other night. A silent conversation we never had. Our interactions were a minimalist play in 3 acts. Act 1. My entrance, the chime of the bell above the door announcing my pathetic arrival. Act 2. My selection process, a slow meander through the aisles pretending I might, just this once, choose something different. I never did. Act 3. The checkout, a silent transaction where the only sounds were the beep of the scanner and the rustle of the plastic bag. I'd murmur a thank you, my voice always sounding thinner than I wanted it to. He would respond with a nod, just a nod, a slight, almost imperceptible dip of his chin. This was the distance between us, the length of the checkout counter and the chasm of our perceived differences. He was the sun, a burning, solid star. I was a stray bit of space debris, caught in his orbit but destined to remain miles away, cold and unnoticed. I built entire narratives around him in the quiet of my apartment. He was a former soldier, a biker, an artist who had given up his craft for a steady income. He had a tragic past, a broken heart, a secret life that explained the profound stillness he carried like a shield. My imagination was a frantic, desperate thing, trying to color in the vast, empty spaces of his silence. I was in love, of course, or something adjacent to it. A deep, aching, hopeless longing for a man who probably didn't even know my name. My life was a fortress of solitude, and I was both its prisoner and its king. I worked as a freelance archival researcher, a job that suited my temperament perfectly. I spent my days sifting through digital records of other people's lives, organizing the chaos of the past into neat, understandable timelines. It was quiet, meticulous work that required no human interaction beyond the occasional email. My apartment was my castle, a small, tidy space filled with books and the soft hum of my computer. It was safe, it was controlled, and it was profoundly, soul-crushingly lonely, a fact I only admitted to myself in the dead of night, with a mouthful of potato chips. Then came the storm. It wasn't a surprise. The weather alerts had been screaming about it for days, a once-in-a-decade weather event. I'd done my due diligence, stocked up on water and canned goods, charged my power banks. I thought I was prepared. I wasn't. The sky turned a bruised, sickly yellow in the late afternoon, and the wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that seemed to seep through the window frames. When the power went out, it wasn't a flicker. It was an abrupt, violent severance. One moment my apartment was bathed in the warm glow of my desk lamp. The next it was plunged into a suffocating, inky blackness. The comforting hum of the refrigerator died. The digital clock vanished. The silence that rushed in was absolute, a physical weight that pressed down on me. My heart, a frantic trapped bird, beat a panicked rhythm against my ribs. I waited for an hour, then two. The wind shrieked, and the rain began to fall not as drops, but as solid sheets of water, drumming against the glass with a terrifying ferocity. My flashlights, I discovered with a sinking feeling, were dead. All of them. An oversight of monumental stupidity. My phone was at 15%. The tidy, controlled world of my apartment had become a dark, claustrophobic box. There was only one place to go. The Night Owl. It was the only business on the block with its own generator, a fact Marcus advertised with a proud, hand-painted sign in the window. The thought of seeing him was a jolt of equal parts terror and desperate need. I pulled on my raincoat, the plastic cold against my skin, and stepped out into the tempest. The world outside was chaos. The wind ripped the hood from my head and tore at my clothes. Rain lashed my face, cold and stinging. The streetlights were dead, the entire block swallowed by darkness, except for it. The store. It glowed at the end of the street, a warm, inviting rectangle of light in the churning black. A lighthouse in the storm. The bell above the door sang its familiar chime as I stumbled inside, dripping and disheveled. The light was blinding after the profound dark. The air was warm and smelled of coffee and cardboard. There were a few other people from the neighborhood huddled near the front, an elderly woman named Mistress Gable and a young couple I recognized from the third floor of my building. And then there was him. Marcus stood behind the counter, looking calmer than anyone had a right to be. He wasn't scowling. His expression was one of intense focus, his jaw set. He was talking to Mistress Gable, his voice a low, reassuring rumble I'd never heard from this close. He wasn't the distant, stoic god of my late-night fantasies. He was just a man holding his ground in the middle of a hurricane. He looked up as I approached, and for the first time, his eyes didn't just slide past me. They lingered. He took in my soaked hair, my trembling hands, my wide, panicked eyes. A flicker of something I couldn't name crossed his face. Concern? Maybe. Need batteries? He asked. His voice was deeper, rougher than I'd imagined. Yes, and maybe a candle. Or 10. I managed to say, my own voice a pathetic squeak. He nodded toward the back aisle. Aisle 4. Take what you need. Looks like we're all in for a long night. The storm worsened. The wind's howl escalated into a full-throated roar. The front door rattled in its frame. Marcus eventually locked it, declaring the store a temporary shelter until the worst of it passed. We were trapped. A handful of strangers and him, marooned on this small island of light. This was the disruption, the violent shove that sent my small, quiet planet spinning off its axis. Forced proximity. I found a corner near the magazine rack and tried to make myself small, observing him as he moved through the store. He made coffee for everyone, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he handled the flimsy paper cups. He found a blanket for Mistress Gable from a box in the back. He spoke quietly with the young couple, calming their frayed nerves with his steady presence. I was seeing a new version of him, not the silent, intimidating clerk, but a caretaker, a protector. The harsh fluorescent lights of the store seemed to carve new details into his face. I saw the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes, a small, white scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the way he'd rubbed the back of his neck when he thought no one was watching, a gesture of profound weariness. He wasn't a myth. He was tired. He was real, and that was infinitely more terrifying. The lights overhead flickered once, twice, then buzzed erratically. A collective groan went through our small group. Marcus cursed under his breath, a soft, frustrated sound. He grabbed a small stepladder from the back and positioned it under the offending light fixture. Just a loose connection, he announced to the room, though it sounded like he was trying to convince himself. He climbed the ladder, his back to me. The muscles in his shoulders and back flexed under his shirt as he reached up to fiddle with the fixture. He was so focused, so intent on this one small act of control in the middle of the chaos. The ladder wobbled on the slick, wet floor. He shifted his weight, and for a horrifying second his foot slipped. He grunted, his body lurching sideways. I didn't think. I moved. I lunged forward, my hand shooting out to steady the metal frame of the ladder. My right hand missed the leg and landed squarely on his calf. The shock of it was instantaneous. A jolt, hot and sharp, that shot up my arm and straight to my chest. His jeans were damp and rough, but underneath I could feel the solid, unyielding muscle, the warmth of his body. It was the first time I had ever touched him. He froze. I froze. My hand was plastered to his leg, my fingers spread wide. The world seemed to narrow to that single point of contact. I could feel the frantic thrum of my own pulse in my fingertips. He looked down, his dark eyes finding my hand, then traveling up my arm to my face. The air crackled. The moment stretched, thin and taut, ready to snap. "Got it?" he asked, his voice strained. "Yeah," I breathed out. "I've got it." He steadied himself and finished with the light, which flickered back to a stable, steady hum. He climbed down the ladder slowly, deliberately. When he was on the floor, he turned to face me. We were standing too close. I could smell the faint scent of coffee and rain on him. I snatched my hand back as if I'd been burned, my cheeks flushing with a heat that had nothing to do with the stuffy air in the store. "Thanks," he said, his gaze intense, unwavering. He was really looking at me now, seeing me. "No problem," I mumbled, my eyes fixed on a fascinating scuff mark on the linoleum floor. Before the awkward silence could completely suffocate us, a new crisis announced itself. The steady, reassuring thrum of the generator from the back room sputtered, coughed, and died. The store was plunged back into darkness, the only light now coming from the emergency exit signs casting a ghastly red glow over everything. A collective gasp. Mistress Gable let out a small, frightened whimper. "Damn it," Marcus snarled. It was a sound of pure, undiluted frustration. He fumbled under the counter, producing a heavy-duty flashlight that cut a powerful beam through the gloom. "Everyone stay calm. I'll get it back on." He strode toward the back room, his silhouette a hulking shape against the flashlight's beam. I could hear him wrestling with the generator, the sound of metal clanking, followed by another vicious curse. He came back out a minute later, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "It's dead. I don't know. The fuel line, maybe? I'm not a mechanic." He raked a hand through his short, dark hair, and in that moment, the confident facade crumbled completely. He looked lost, vulnerable, and then I heard myself speak. The words just came out, unbidden, from some long-dormant part of my brain. "I can look at it." Marcus turned the flashlight beam on me. I had to squint against the glare. My dad used to restore old motorcycles. I spent most of my teenage years covered in grease, handing him wrenches. I know little about small engines, it was true. A part of my life I had packed away, a memory of a father I barely spoke to anymore. He stared at me for a long moment. The silence was thick with the sound of the storm and his unspoken doubt. The power dynamic had shifted, tilted on its side. He was the one who needed help. I was the one who, improbably, might have the answer. The playing field, for the first time, felt level. "All right, motorcycle man," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. It transformed his entire face. "Let's see what you've got." He led me into the storeroom. It was a small, cramped space, a chaotic jungle of stacked boxes, cleaning supplies, and metal shelving. The air was cool and damp, thick with the smell of cardboard and the acrid scent of gasoline from the dead generator. He set the flashlight down on a crate, angling the beam toward the machine. It cast long, dancing shadows that made the small room feel even more claustrophobic. We were alone. The sounds of the storm and the other people in the store were muffled, distant. Here, in this dimly lit pocket of the world, it was just the two of us, the silent generator a dead weight between us. "Tools are in that box," he said, gesturing with his chin. I knelt beside the generator, my hand surprisingly steady as I opened the toolbox. The familiar, cold weight of a wrench felt good in my palm. It was a language I understood. Nuts and bolts, fuel lines, and spark plugs. They were logical, solvable problems. Unlike the terrifying, illogical problem of the man standing a few feet behind me, watching my every move. I worked in silence for a few minutes, my mind focused on the task. I checked the spark plug, cleared the fuel filter. My hands remembered the old rhythms, the right amount of pressure to apply, the feel of a thread catching. Marcus didn't speak. He just stood there, a solid, watchful presence in the small space. His stillness was a tangible thing, a pressure on the back of my neck. "You're here a lot," he said suddenly. His voice, quiet in the enclosed space, made me jump. I fumbled with a socket wrench, dropping it with a clatter. "Sorry, it's fine," he said. "I just mean you come in late. Always get the same things," my stomach filled with a swarm of angry bees. He noticed. Of course he noticed. He probably thought I was the saddest man in the world. Salt and vinegar chips and solitude. "Creature of habit," I said, my voice tight. I refused to look at him, keeping my eyes fixed on the engine block. "You always have this look on your face," he continued, his tone conversational, but with an undercurrent I couldn't decipher. "Like you're trying to figure something out. A puzzle." I risked a glance over my shoulder. He was leaning against a stack of boxes, his arms crossed over his chest. The flashlight beam caught the silver of the scar in his eyebrow. "I'm a researcher," I offered, as if that explained everything. "Yeah." He paused. I always figured the puzzle was me. The air went out of my lungs. My heart did a painful, stuttering flip in my chest. He knew. He had seen my stupid, hopeful, terrified glances. He had seen me watching him from across the counter, from behind the safety of my own assumptions. The heat rushed back to my face, a tidal wave of embarrassment. I wanted the floor to open up and swallow me whole. I don't know what you mean," I lied, my voice cracking. He let out a short, humorless laugh. "It's okay. I get it. I'm the scary tattooed guy behind the counter. The ex-con, the burnout." He ticked them off on his fingers. "I've heard them all. I never thought that," I said, and it was the truest thing I had ever said to him. I turned to face him fully, the wrench still clutched in my hand like a weapon. "I just thought, you seem like you had things figured out." Contained? He pushed off the boxes and took a step closer. The shadows shifted, throwing his face in a sharp relief. "That's one word for it. Trapped is another." We stared at each other across the 3 feet of concrete floor that felt like a canyon. The confession hung in the air between us, raw and unexpected. He had just handed me a piece of himself, a jagged, vulnerable truth. All my carefully constructed narratives about him shattered, turning to dust. I said, my voice barely a whisper, "I think I found the problem." I pointed a greasy finger at a small, cracked tube. "Clogged fuel line. Just need to clear it." It was a clumsy attempt to change the subject, to retreat to the safety of the mechanical. But he didn't let me. He took another step, closing the distance between us. He was so close now, I could see the flecks of gold in his dark brown eyes. "Thank you," he said, and he wasn't talking about the generator. I worked on the fuel line, my fingers clumsy now, my mind reeling from his words. Trapped. That one word echoed in my head. I understood that feeling. I cleared the blockage and reattached the line, my knuckles brushing against the cold metal of the engine. "Try now," I said, my voice hoarse. He reached over and pulled the starter cord. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then roared to life, a deafening, beautiful sound. The lights in the storeroom flickered on, harsh and white, banishing the shadows. A cheer went up from the main part of the store. We had done it. We had brought back the light. The noise of the generator made conversation impossible. We just stood there for a moment in the shared victory. A wide, genuine smile broke across his face. It was dazzling. It was like seeing the sun for the first time. He clapped me on the shoulder, a solid, friendly gesture that sent another jolt through my system. He led the way out of the storeroom, and I followed, feeling dazed. The little group of refugees applauded as I emerged, greasy and triumphant. Mistress Gable called me a hero. I felt my face burn. Marcus just stood by the door, that small, incredible smile still on his lips. As the night wore on and the storm began to lose its fury, the others staked out places to sleep. The young couple curled up in the pet food aisle. Mistress Gable dozed in a chair Marcus had found for her. But I couldn't sleep. I was too wired, my mind buzzing with the events of the night. The touch, the confession, the smile. I found Marcus in the back, methodically restocking a shelf of canned soup. It seemed like a nervous habit, a need to restore order. You should get some rest, I said quietly, not wanting to wake the others. He didn't look at me. Can't. Someone's got to keep watch. I can, I offered. You did all the work earlier. He finally stopped, a can of minestrone in his hand. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. You did all right yourself, motorcycle man. The nickname sent a ridiculous, pleased warmth through me. We stood in the quiet aisle, the only sounds the hum of the refrigerators and the distant rumble of the dying storm. The unspoken things from the storeroom were still there, hanging in the air between us, thick and heavy. Why did you say that? I asked, needing to know. That you were trapped? He put the can on the shelf with meticulous precision. He took a long time to answer. This store, it was my father's. He died 2 years ago. Left it to me. I had other plans. I was going to move away, go to school for landscape architecture. I like making things grow. He looked down at his calloused hands. But this place was all my mom had left of him. I couldn't just sell it. So I stayed. And now here I am. Stocking soup. It was a whole life story in a handful of sentences. A story of duty and sacrifice and quiet resignation. It was so much more real and painful than any of the dramatic fantasies I had invented for him. My heart ached for him. I'm sorry, I said, the words feeling small and inadequate. Don't be. He finally met my eyes, and his gaze was so direct, so intense, it felt like a physical touch. It's just life. He took a half step closer. We were in the narrow space between the shelves, surrounded by cans of beans and tomatoes. An intimate canyon of processed foods. What about you? What keeps you locked up in that apartment all day? It's safe, I admitted. I organize things. Data. Information. It makes sense. People don't know, he said, his voice a low murmur. They don't. And then he reached out. It wasn't an accident this time. It was deliberate. His hand came up, and his fingers, rough and calloused, brushed against my cheek. It was the softest, most tentative touch I had ever felt. My breath caught in my throat. I leaned into his touch, my eyes fluttering shut. This is happening. This is real. The first kiss wasn't frantic or passionate. It was a question. His lips were soft, hesitant against mine. It was a slow, careful exploration in the silent, fluorescent-lit aisle of his father's store. It was a confession more profound than any words we had spoken. It tasted of coffee and rain and a loneliness so deep it mirrored my own. I brought my hand up to his chest, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart beneath my palm. He wasn't a myth or a puzzle. He was Marcus, and he was kissing me. And for the first time in a very long time, my quiet, orderly world was filled with a beautiful, terrifying, wonderful chaos. The kiss ended as slowly as it began. We pulled apart, but he didn't let go completely. His hand slid from my cheek to the back of my neck, his thumb stroking my skin. We just stood there, breathing the same air, our foreheads resting against each other. The world outside, the storm, the sleeping strangers, it all faded away. There was only the hum of the coolers and the frantic, synchronized beating of our two hearts. The morning came too soon. The storm had broken, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening under a pale, watery sun. The city began to stir back to life. Mistress Gable and the young couple thanked Marcus profusely and departed, leaving the three of us in the suddenly cavernous-feeling store. The intimacy of the night evaporated with the morning light. The air grew thin and awkward. Marcus was different. The vulnerability was gone, replaced by a cool, professional distance. He was the clerk again. He moved behind the counter, busying himself with the cash register, avoiding my eyes. The change was so abrupt it felt like a physical blow. A door had been slammed shut in my face. My heart began its familiar descent into the cold, dark pit of my stomach. The anxiety, a familiar monster, uncoiled itself. It was a mistake, a trick of the light, a product of crisis and confinement. He regrets it. He must. Well, I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet store. I should go. He finally looked at me, but his expression was guarded, his eyes shadowed. Right? Yeah, you should. He didn't smile. He didn't move from behind the counter. The barrier was back up, higher and more formidable than ever before. Thank for, the shelter, I said, my words stumbling over each other. Don't mention it, he said, his tone flat. He turned his attention back to the register, effectively dismissing me. I walked out of the store, the chime of the bell sounding like a funeral dirge. The bright morning sun felt like an accusation. I didn't look back. I fled to the safety of my apartment, my mind a churning vortex of self-recrimination. I had misread everything. The kindness, the confession, the kiss. I had projected my own desperate longing onto him and created a fantasy. He was just being kind, and I had taken it as something more. The shame was a hot, metallic taste in my mouth. I was an idiot, a lonely, pathetic idiot. My apartment, my former sanctuary, felt like a prison. The silence was no longer comforting. It was accusatory. Every quiet corner screamed his absence. The routine I had once clung to now felt like a cage of my own making. I replayed every moment of the night, every word, every touch, dissecting them until they were meaningless. My own memory became an unreliable narrator. Had his hand lingered on my neck? Was the kiss really that gentle? Or had I imagined it? The doubt was a poison, seeping into everything. One day passed, then two, a lifetime of silence. I didn't leave my apartment. The thought of walking past the store, of seeing him through the window, was unbearable. I imagined him behind the counter, his face set in that familiar scowl, a scowl that I now understood was meant for me, a look of regret and annoyance. The thought was a physical pain, a sharp twisting in my gut. My solitude, once a familiar companion, was now tainted. It was no longer just solitude. It was an absence. The space where he had been for a few short hours was now a gaping, echoing void. I tried to work, to lose myself in the neat, orderly lives of long-dead people, but the words on the screen blurred. My own life, my own feelings were too chaotic, too loud. I subsisted on stale crackers and tap water, punishing myself for my foolishness. The bag of salt and vinegar chips he had sold me 100 times sat on my counter, unopened, a monument to my stupidity. On the evening of the third day, there was a knock on my door. It was so unexpected that for a moment I thought I had imagined it. No one ever knocked on my door. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. Another knock, louder this time, more insistent. With trembling hands, I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open a few inches. And there he was, Marcus. He was standing in the dimly lit hallway of my apartment building, looking as out of place as a mountain in a shoebox. He wasn't wearing his work shirt. He had on a simple gray hoodie, and he looked nervous. His shoulders were hunched, his hands shoved into his pockets. The confident, imposing man from the store was gone. This was the man from the storeroom. Vulnerable. Real. He was holding a small paper bag. You didn't come by, he said, his voice low. He wouldn't meet my eyes, focusing instead on the peeling paint on my doorframe. I couldn't speak. My throat was tight, my mind a blank slate of shock. He pulled one hand from his pocket and held out the bag. I brought you these, I took the bag. Inside was a bag of salt and vinegar chips and a bar of dark chocolate. My usuals. The gesture was so simple, so thoughtful, it shattered the fragile wall of anger and self-pity I had built around myself. Can I come in? He asked, finally looking at me. His eyes were filled with an exhaustion that mirrored my own. I stepped back, holding the door open. He walked into my small living room, his presence immediately filling the space. He looked around at my shelves of books, at the piles of research papers on my desk, at the single coffee mug in the sink. He was seeing my life, my solitude, laid bare. I'm sorry, he said, turning to face me. I was an ass, you were distant. I corrected, finding my voice. It came out as a whisper. I panicked, he said, the words rushing out of him now. That night, in the store, it was a lot. For me. And then the morning came, and everything was back to normal, and I didn't know how to act. I don't know how to do this. He gestured vaguely between us. I thought I imagined it. I confessed, the admission costing me everything. I thought I made it all up. No. He shook his head, his expression pained. You didn't imagine it. I'm good at being alone. Leo, he said my name. He had never said my name before. It sounded foreign and perfect coming from his lips. I've been alone for a long time. It's easier. It's safer. What happened between us, it wasn't safe. And it scared the hell out of me. He took a hesitant step closer. These last few days, not seeing you come into the store, it's been worse. The quiet was louder than the generator. The honesty in his voice was a balm on my frayed nerves. He had been scared too. He had felt the silence too. I wasn't alone in my spiraling anxiety. We were just two people terrified of the same thing. A genuine connection. A risk. It scared me too, I admitted. I'm also good at being alone. A small, sad smile touched his lips. A pair of experts. Then he reached into the pocket of his hoodie and pulled out a single, shiny key attached to a simple metal ring. He held it out to me. It was the key to the store. "What's this for?" I asked, my voice trembling. "For emergencies," he said, his eyes holding mine. "Or, if you run out of snacks in the middle of the night." A faint blush colored his cheeks. "Or if you just want to be there." It wasn't just a key. It was an invitation, an act of trust, a promise that the door wouldn't be slammed shut again. It was the most romantic, terrifying thing anyone had ever offered me. I took the key, my fingers brushing against his. The familiar spark was there, a low, steady current this time. Not a shock, but a warmth. A connection. "I don't want to be an expert at being alone anymore, Marcus," I said. "Me neither," he whispered. And he closed the small remaining distance between us and kissed me again. This time, there was no hesitation. It was a kiss of reassurance, of homecoming. A promise of a new beginning, made in the quiet sanctuary of my own small world, which suddenly didn't feel so small anymore. Our new beginning wasn't a grand, cinematic event. It was a series of small, quiet moments that slowly, carefully wove our two solitary lives together. It was Marcus in my apartment, not as an intruder, but as a comforting presence. He'd sit on my worn-out sofa, watching me work, the quiet tap of my keyboard a counterpoint to the soft rustle of the newspaper he was reading. He never made me feel like my quiet world was strange. He just stepped into it, finding a space for himself. He was fascinated by my work. He'd look over my shoulder at the centuries-old documents on my screen, at the intricate family trees I was building. "You bring order to chaos," he said once, his voice full of a quiet awe that made me feel seen in a way I never had before. The man who brought order to his shelves, saw the same impulse in me. And I found a place in his world. I started using the key, not for late-night snack emergencies, but for him. I let myself in after he'd locked up for the night, and I'd find him in the back, doing inventory or mopping the floors. I'd grab a rag and help, working beside him in comfortable silence. We learned the rhythm of each other's movements, a silent dance in the brightly lit aisles. Sharing a coffee behind the counter at 2 in the morning became our ritual, our stolen moment of peace in the sleeping city. One night, I brought my laptop to the store and worked from the small, cramped office in the back while he managed the front. The hum of the coolers, the chime of the bell, the low murmur of his voice with customers. These sounds, once just background noise in my life, became the soundtrack of my contentment. I was no longer an observer in his world. I was a part of it. The first time he stayed the night, I was a wreck of anxiety. But there was no morning after recoil. I woke to the smell of coffee. He was in my tiny kitchen, navigating the unfamiliar space with a careful grace, making us breakfast. He smiled at me over the rim of his coffee mug, a simple, domestic smile that felt more intimate than any kiss. Seeing his broad frame fill my small kitchen, seeing him comfortable and at ease in my space, quieted the last of the frantic birds in my chest. This was real. This was ours. We started making things grow together. On his day off, we went to a nursery and bought trays of seedlings. We spent the afternoon on the small, neglected rooftop of his building, filling planters with soil, our hands covered in dirt. He showed me how to gently loosen the roots, how to give each plant the space it needed to thrive. He talked about landscape architecture, his voice full of a passion I had never heard before. He wasn't just a clerk. He was a creator, a nurturer, a man who dreamed of making beautiful things. And as I watched him, his face smudged with dirt, the sun warming his skin, I saw not the man who was trapped, but the man who was finding his way out. My life used to be a straight line, a predictable orbit around a solitary star. Marcus was a disruption, a meteor that crashed into my carefully controlled world, scattering debris and chaos everywhere. But in the wreckage, something new began to grow. He didn't just enter my life, he expanded it. He pushed the walls of my fortress out, letting in light and air and the terrifying, beautiful possibility of a shared future. I didn't go to the store that night looking for love. I was looking for comfort in a bag of chips, but I found it in the steady gaze of a man I thought was a stranger. A man who was just as scared and just as lonely as I was. He was the plot twist I never saw coming, the unexpected variable that threw off all my calculations. He was the beautiful, illogical, chaotic answer to a question I was too afraid to even ask myself. He was the man who taught me that the bravest thing you can ever do is hand someone a key and trust that they'll know what it's for.